Some backpedaling from JPMorgan today. It appears the company's U.S. and Asia-based tech analysts can't agree on whether Apple is cutting orders for its iPads from suppliers or not. According to a research report published earlier by JPMorgan's Asia team, Apple is reducing orders for iPad parts by 25%. U.S.-based JPMorgan analyst Mark Moskowitz says this does not represent the views of JPMorgan's U.S. team and said that this announcement made the market's worried about Apple, but he added that Apple is fine. Joining me now to discuss this is Bill Whyman from the ISI Group in Washington and Brian Blair of Wedge Partners in New York. Gentlemen, welcome to Bloomberg West. Brian, let's start with you. What are you hearing about whether or not Apple is indeed cutting orders for iPads out there in Asia?
We believe they are. We believe there actually have been cuts, not to the 25% that JPMorgan spoke of, but we believe there have been cuts to the 15 to 20% range, and that's been the chatter in the supply chain for the last week. But one thing to remember is this may not just be a demand issue. We know there's a new Foxconn facility opening up in Brazil. This could be Apple moving some of that production to Brazil. It could also be that Apple often gives a very high forecast for their builds, and this just could be them trimming back those forecasts as we get closer to the end of the year, still showing really strong growth for units from June to September to December.
Bill, how about you? I mean, what are your thoughts on whether Apple is cutting orders or not? And isn't it strange that JPMorgan's own analysts can't even agree with each other?
Well, where you sit is where you stand, and they're in very different geographies. I think the big issue here is consumer tech demand is very, very weak. We had very bad numbers from Best Buy. Last week I was in Asia. I didn't hear anything good, whether it's PCs, TVs, and the pressures on the consumer are pretty self-evident. So I think the larger message here is consumer tech is facing a lot of headwinds. Apple clearly is a strong product. I'm less worried about Apple than I am worried about the rest of consumer tech.
Brian, we've seen blowout quarters from Apple in terms of iPad sales. Is that going to change this time around? Are iPad sales going to slow down? I
don't think they will. I think Bill's point's a good one. We are seeing weakness across a lot of other consumer electronics. We saw it in Best Buy's recent report. They'd seen a real slowdown in their handsets. But I think that Apple's still going to put up very strong numbers, both for iPhone as well as for iPad. But it's just that as we get close to this time of the end of the year, sometimes there's a little bit of conservatism and moving around with the actual production numbers, and I think that's what we're still seeing. Apple is still has the two of the strongest selling products globally right now with the iPad and the iPhone, and that's not stopping. But this headline, I think, is real. I do think that there has been a cut in production, but I think, like I said, this is probably Apple overestimating what they thought they could build this year and just pulling it back a little bit as they get close to the end of the year. They just reported, they just did 9 million units in June. They are probably going to do in the 11 million unit range this quarter, and even if you haircut most estimates by 15 or 20%, you can still get to a 13-ish million unit number for December, which is staggering year-over-year growth for the iPad.
Now, Brian, we've been seeing multiple reports that Apple is going to have some kind of a media event on October 4th, next Tuesday. We're thinking this might be the introduction of the iPhone 5. Is something going to happen on Tuesday, and if so, what?
Whether it's Tuesday or whether it's Wednesday, I do believe that the Wall Street Journal is accurate that it's going to be that week. Apple's events have been on a Wednesday the last couple of years, and they've traditionally been held at the Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco. It is likely that it is Tuesday, and the rumors might be true that it may be held at Apple's headquarters in Cupertino. But we do believe Apple is going to hold an event, and this is where they will show the refreshed iPhone, as well as probably some slightly updated iPod models.
Bill, what are you expecting to happen next week? Are we going to see the iPhone 5? Are we going to see a cheaper version of the iPhone 4?
Yeah, I think we will see an iPhone 5. There's a big debate about how many different devices. The one thing I think you can count on is that the devices will be more powerful. The hardware will get you that. What I would encourage people to look at is the new iOS software, which is important, and more details around the cloud offering, iCloud. The competition will get better and better. We're now on version 5. It's tougher and tougher to keep that hardware gap, and I think the software and services become more important. And the new OS and the new cloud offering, I think, is really where people should be looking at.
So, Bill, does this mean you don't think a cheaper version of the iPhone is going to come out, that Apple's going to stick with its next model?
So I think they try and address that with a lower memory price. So if you put less memory, you effectively drop the price. I think Apple's reluctant to do anything that would in any way tarnish the premium brand. And as you know, the company has said over and over again, they're very protective of the core experience. So at this point, it's speculation, it's reasoning from data points that we had, but I would expect to continue to see one family of products rather than a whole nother SKU.
Brian, we've been hearing about potential design changes, potentially a curved handset coming out with the iPhone 5. Is that something we're going to see, or is that not happening?
I don't believe so. I think it's more likely that Apple is going to offer just a very slightly changed piece of hardware that closely resembles the iPhone 4. To your earlier question, and Bill addressed it, what Apple has done for the last few years is they've taken the previous model, and when the new model has come out, the older model has gone down to $99, allowing Apple to address the mid-tier of the market and eventually move towards the low end. But I think this is going to be a very slightly changed hardware on the outside. I think there's only going to be one new phone, unlike some reports that are suggesting two new phones. I think we're going to see one new one, and I think the focus, as Bill mentioned, is going to be on the iOS 5 software. It's going to have the A5 processor, much like the current iPad 2. There's a good chance it will offer some new voice functionality, and I think it will offer an 8-megapixel camera as well. All strong upgraded features. But in terms of the hardware, I'm only expecting a slight upgrade. Slight change.
Now, obviously, the question everyone wants to know the answer to is whether Steve Jobs is going to make an appearance. Brian, do you think we're going to see a cameo appearance from Steve Jobs?
I sure hope so. It wouldn't be an Apple event without him. But it's very possible he could be sitting in the front row and hand the reins over, to the event, hand him over to Tim Cook, which I think would be a good gesture. But I sure hope we see him.
Bill, how about you? This is going to be Tim Cook's first event as officially the new CEO of Apple. How are you expecting the event to play out? How are you expecting Apple's other top lieutenants to play roles here?
Right. So the Apple faithful, the believers, everyone wants to see Steve Jobs. I think what they really need to do here is sell success. They have great products. As Brian mentioned, the tablet and the smartphone are the two of the strongest products in consumer tech anywhere. They have success. We're in the middle of a transition. There's going to be a lot of speculation both ways. No matter what happens, you'll have people criticizing it. They should just sell success. They have a great product roadmap. They have great stories. And that should, I think, is really the focus of this event.
All right, Bill Whyman of ISI Group and Brian Blair of Wedge Partners, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be watching for what happens next week with the iPhone 5.